By 1995, Charlie Nam was making preparations to retire from Florida State University after 3 decades of research, teaching, and service to the discipline. As part of those preparations, he took this opportunity to look back over one of the research questions that had engaged his interest since his first article on the topic from 1968, the question of mortality crossovers at the oldest ages.
Well, first of all, this article is my attempt to review the literature on mortality crossovers and reach a conclusion about the contributing factors.
In this summation of more than a quarter century of progress towards understanding mortality crossovers, progress in which his own published work had played a continuing part, Charlie was careful to begin by pointing back another 40 years before his own first contribution on the subject to highlight the truly pioneering work of Raymond Pearl. As part of a remarkable and wide-ranging series of lectures on the biology of death at the Lowell Institute in Boston, Pearl had included one lecture entitled The Chances of Death, dealing with patterns of timing and probability that he observed in human mortality.
I did not know Raymond Pearl personally, although I did at the first Population Association meeting. I was introduced to him. He was a biologist at Johns Hopkins University. His writings on various demographic topics were revealing. He was one of the founders of the Population Association of America and of the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population.
In that third lecture on the biology of death, Pearl presented a striking example of a mortality crossover that occurred at ages between 60 and 70, comparing death rates from the United States in his own day with death rates attributed to people living in ancient provinces of the Roman Empire.
Pearl wrote, during a period of approximately 2,000 years, man's expectation of life at birth and subsequent early ages has been steadily improving, while at the same time his expectation of life at advanced ages has been steadily worsening. Because this process tends to preserve the weaklings, there appear now in the higher age groups of the population many weaker individuals than formerly ever got there. Consequently, the average expectation of life at ages beyond, say, 60 to 70 is not nearly so good now as it was under the more rigorous regime of ancient Rome.
This article had a profound effect on Charlie Nam's approach to the subject, providing him with the explanatory concept of how different intensities of selection operating on different populations might generate crossovers of mortality rates at older ages as part of a larger lifelong process of convergence. The remarkable figure from Pearl's 1921 lecture also provided additional useful observations that inspired many other researchers studying human mortality patterns. For instance, Pearl pointed out, while today it seems normal in our own society that death rates for men are higher than death rates for women at all ages, from the cradle to the grave, and even during gestation prior to birth, the situation observed in the ancient Roman Empire was actually the reverse of this pattern.
The expectation of life of females was poorer at practically all ages of life than that of the males, which exactly reverses the modern state of affairs. MacDonald believes this difference to be real and to indicate that there were special influences adversely affecting the health of females in the Roman Empire, which no longer operate in the modern world.
Pearl even noticed and offered an explanation for the jagged, irregular character of the death rate curves he presented from ancient Rome, suggesting that this was the result of what we now call age heaping, as people tend to round their reported ages up or down to the nearest age ending in 0 or 5 in settings where precise ages are not carefully recorded, not important in everyday life, or possibly not even clearly known. In his own subsequent research, Charlie always stressed that such crossovers were simply one dramatic moment in that larger, lifelong process that produced different slopes for a graphical plot comparing death rates for such contrasted populations.
As you see in the figure, death rates beginning at age 45 increased by age for both whites and blacks in the United States, but they increased more rapidly for whites than blacks. As a consequence, we see different slopes of age patterns of mortality for the two groups. Well, the fact that the slopes of the two curves are different indicates that some forces are operating differently for the two groups.
After Charlie Nam's 1968 article on crossovers, which was not widely circulated in a major journal, and particularly after his 1978 follow-up on the topic a decade later in Social Biology, this research issue began to gain traction among a growing group of scholars. A year after Nam's 1978 social biology paper, Jim Voppel climbed onto the bandwagon, advancing an explanation of mortality crossovers rooted in survival of a higher proportion of frail people at old ages in a population that has been subjected to lower selective mortality pressures than some other comparison group.
Well, Manton and Stollard and Voppel and his associates highlighted the heterogeneity of frailty in populations and the timing of the selection mechanisms. They argued that if one population is subjected to a harsher environment and hence a greater force of mortality in the early and middle ages, then a smaller and more highly selected proportion of that population is likely to survive beyond those ages. The survivors are a subgroup of the starting population whose constitutional endowment is not restricted to genetic determinants of longevity, but includes a variety of life experiences and exposure that may influence heterogeneity and longevity.
Voppel's work highlighted the underlying assumption that every population starts out from birth with a range of inborn variations in the hardiness or robustness of individuals, a starting distribution of frailty that concentrates mortality, particularly on the weaker individuals. This idea again goes straight back to Pearl's 1921 article, where he concluded that, quote, inherited constitution fundamentally and primarily determines how long an individual will live, unquote. Pearl himself pointed even further back in time to the work of mathematician Carl Pearson, who commented that mortality crossovers provide, quote, either a strong argument for the survival of the physically fitter man or for the survival of the civilly fitter society, unquote. Without such an underlying frailty distribution in a population, there would be no reason to expect mortality crossovers ever to occur. Scholars like Nam or Voppel did not have things all their own way, however, since the selection effect explanation gained currency at the end of the 1970s. During the 1980s, in particular, a number of leading demographers expressed doubts about whether crossovers actually happened, or whether they might instead reflect measurement errors in the data that seemed to reveal them.
Well, to begin with, Kitagawa and Hauser, who were doing a study of socioeconomic differentials in mortality, adjusted their data for age misreporting and census undercounting, but they still found mortality crossovers.
These concerns over methodology emerged mainly from what is sometimes called the Princeton-Penn axis, a community of scholars from those two elite private universities that played a central role in the development of demography as a discipline over the past century or more. Ansley Cole at Princeton raised these issues in his 1986 article with Ellen Kisker, at about the same time that Sam Preston at Penn was voicing similar doubts about the reliability of evidence for crossovers.
Cole and Kisker claimed that age misreporting and greater underregistration of deaths for blacks and whites at older ages explained crossovers. Schoen, Rosenwake, and Elo and Preston used other approaches and argued the same, that the data errors could account for the crossover. I had conversations with Cole about some of these issues, as I did with Preston and Elo, but we never came to a common conclusion.
Many of these investigations of data quality for crossovers, however, placed much of their emphasis on problems like misreporting ages or undercounting deaths that have the most serious effects at older ages. Such arguments do not have the same explanatory power at younger ages, and the proponents of the frailty and selection explanation, like Nam, Vappel, Manton, and others, insist that differential selection occurs throughout life and produces convergence of mortality curves with different slopes long before we reach older ages where crossovers actually happen.
There is a question about the reliability of the data. But even if that is a problem, it is not sufficient to account for the varying slopes. That has an effect, but it's dwarfed by more other forces that are operating. In each case where these data problems were discovered, they were still a crossover. Kestenbaum calculated age-specific mortality using the highly reliable data from the Social Security Administration's master beneficiary record and found a mortality crossover for blacks and whites in the U.S. In general, allowing for limitations has some effect on mortality crossovers, but at best a small part of it. Most of the critics of the mortality crossover phenomenon explained by the selection process hold fast to their emphasis on data problems, but I think a consensus is emerging that recognizes the probable joint effect. Let me add that I discovered mortality crossovers not only for pairs of human populations, but also among other living beings. And I call attention to a master's thesis done at the University of Pittsburgh in 1955. It was an inquiry into the relative survival of starved and unstarved fruit flies and showed a mortality crossover.
It seems safe to say that we have not heard the last of this ongoing debate about the causes and interpretation of mortality crossovers. But Charlie Nam is sticking to his guns in the belief that no matter how much we refine our measurements, the combination of a range of frailty in human populations with the different life chances experienced by different groups in society will prove to be a fruitful explanation of the crossover pattern that at first sight might seem paradoxical to us.